In 2021, we became the first private landowners in British history to legally release beavers into the wild. So to date, we have relocated 20 animals from places where they come into conflict with people, and we've released them to unenclosed, unfenced ponds on our land and given them a second chance at life.
Hello and welcome to Thrill of the Hill. My name's Alex Perry and this is the Farm Advisory Service podcast where we cover the hot topics impacting the farmed upland environment. The reintroduction of beavers to Scotland offers us an exciting opportunity to restore habitats and build nature value across a range of ecosystems, but it's not without its challenges. Beavers have led to the restoration of wetlands and the betterment of the water environment, but their natural behaviours have also caused damage and disruption for farmers. To help us navigate this tricky balancing act, I'm joined by farmer, rewilding advocate, and the author of The Waters of Life, Tom Bowser, to hear about how he navigates this complicated topic and the impact beavers have had at Lerrocks farm. Hi there, Tom. How are you doing?
Hi, Alec. How are you?
Absolutely brilliant. Today's a cracking afternoon, and we're looking forward to recording the first episode of Thrill of the Hill this season. So welcome to the podcast and thanks for coming on.
Thank you so much for having me. Good to see you again.
Tom, you and I have spoken over the last wee while about getting you on the podcast to discuss beaver reintroductions into Scotland and talk a little bit about some of the practicalities of your own experience. But before we get kicked off with the episode, do you have any reflections on the last two episodes that we've done on Thrill of the Hill? How did you receive those podcast episodes?
Yeah, I thought that both episodes were really good, really balanced, showed different aspects of beaver reintroduction, but yeah, I thought both guests were very good and spoke very candidly. Yeah, excellent.
We'll include the links for those episodes in the show notes for this episode. So, by all means, listeners should check out the webpage and you'll find the necessary links. But Tom, we'll get kicked off with our own discussion this afternoon. Can we just get an introduction into who you are and what your role is in beaver reintroduction in Scotland and the kind of wider aims that you have within the industry?
So my name is Tom Bowser. I come from Argaty, which is a working sheep and beef farm on the Braes of Doon in central Scotland. The farm's been in my family since 1916, so I'm the fifth generation to grow up here, and my daughters are the sixth. We try and run the farm with two aims in mind. The first is to produce food as sustainably as possible, work that's carried out really well by our contract farmers. And the other aim is to try and make our home as good a home as possible for wildlife. We do that in a mix of ways. So some you would probably call just kind of good old-fashioned top-down conservation, planting woodland, planting hedgerows, digging out ponds, etc. And then the other half is what we might slightly pretentiously call our rewilding projects. So we are home to Central Scotland's only red kite feeding station. Red kites were introduced into our area and came and started roosting and then nesting on the farm, and we turned the farm into a safe haven for them so people could come and see them and learn about them. And then, relevant to this episode, in 2021, we became the first private landowners in British history to legally release beavers into the wild. So to date, we have relocated 20 animals from places where they come into conflict with people, and we've released them to unenclosed, unfenced ponds on our land and given them a second chance at life.
And how are you finding that? What's the reception to that been?
So reception broadly has been really great. Beavers have opened so many doors for us. We've met lots of interesting people that we would never have had the chance to meet otherwise. Featured on Spring Watch, filmed with Hamza Yassin and Gordon Buchanan. I've written a book on the back of it. Just lots of opportunities that would never have come our way otherwise. And generally speaking, people are really interested in hearing the story of what the beavers are doing on a farm like ours, which is really great. There is, as previous episodes have kind of shown, there's another side, of course, to beavers in Scotland, and there's a part of it that when you're advocating for these animals can be quite confrontational and quite draining. And yeah, we're very much, I think, at still at the forefront of that because we've been so known, I suppose, for being the first people to do this. And because we're not an organisation like, say, the RSPB or the Cairngorms National Park, you tend to be a face of the organisation when it's just you and your parents
Mhm.
and a small team running it, you know? So, yeah, there's a side of it that's very hard, but most of it is really great.
And just circling back to the red kites before we get into the beavers,
Mm.
was it a conscious decision to introduce or undertake management that would bring them onto the farm, or do you know did you just undertake good practice and it just kind of naturally happened itself?
Yeah, more the latter, actually, Alec. Yeah, great question. More the latter. So, what's really interesting when you compare the kites return and the beavers is that back in the 1990s, when kites were brought back, all you had to do, and this was no mean feat, but if you were a conservationist that wanted to bring back a species, you had to get permission from on high, from back then, I suppose it would have been nature agencies would give you permission, and you could do it without any kind of real community consultation or anything like that. So the first we knew about kites being reintroduced to the immediate neighbouring estate to ours, literally 5 miles away, was one day when my dad was finishing a day's work on the farm and walking back along the yard to the house, and he heard this whistling call, and he looked up and he thought, "Oh God, those aren't buzzards." And he called up the RSPB, all full of enthusiasm. He said, "Guys, you're never going to believe what's flying over my farm, but I think it's red kites." And there was a long, awkward silence, and then they said, "Yeah, we know." So, yeah, it turned out that, unbeknownst to us, we had really good habitat for them. We had quite a lot of woodland, great for them for nesting and roosting in. But Argaty is a bit of a mix of kind of grass parkland on the southern side, and then the northern end, big, wide, open moorland. So very much kind of gateway to the to the Highlands territory, and that suited the kites down to the ground. So they really chose us, and they've never gone.
Fantastic. And moving back to beavers then, from your perspective, Tom, why are beavers worth having back in Scotland? I mean, that's a huge question and it'll span the length of this podcast episode, but in a nutshell, why should we be enthusiastic about having beavers back in Scotland?
Yeah, sure. That is a great question as well. I think if I were to try and sum it up, I would say I think beavers are one of the most, if not the most important species that we have at a time when an environmental crisis is outpacing all of us. They're a real force for good. And what they do is they create these massive, sprawling, deadwood filled wetlands, and by impounding water with their dams and by felling trees and creating this deadwood, they boost invertebrate numbers. And from there, you get a whole food chain being built from the bottom up. So I think they're really, really important. And I hope that our farm really is a great demonstration of the good places you can have them up in the headwaters where they can do most good, is really where you want to go to see beaver benefits to the full.
And they've often been described as ecosystem engineers. I've heard them referred to as keystone species. Can you just explain what that actually means on the ground? What is it that they do that is so impactful?
Sure. So, I mean, these terms, not, I don't know how scientific they are, but a keystone species, literally, you can imagine an arc being built and the keystone being the stone in the middle that holds the whole thing together. So, the idea is that there are some species whose impact on the wider ecosystem is so valuable that if you were to remove them, then the whole thing collapses. So, examples of that, apart from beavers, might be bumblebees, perhaps, or large predators in the sea, large land-based predators, maybe even things like earthworms you might consider to be um, on that same kind of level. And each ecosystem will have these species that just have a disproportionate beneficial impact on their surrounding environment. And yeah, for beavers, it's really how they create these very different habitats, which really in Britain, the only other species that really alters its landscape to suit its own needs in the way that beavers do is people. But we don't do it half as well for nature as they do.
And historically, they were fairly widespread across Scotland. I mean, conflict with humans notwithstanding, they were fairly present across the country.
Sure. Yeah, we know that they would have come in after the last glaciation. So about 10,000 years ago, they would have re-entered what we now call Britain, and they would have moved north, just kind of retaking empty wetlands as they went. We've we know that the remains have been found from peat bogs in the Scottish borders, right up to sites in the Highlands, even in a midden in Edinburgh Castle, which suggests that people there must have eaten them at one point. What we don't really know, Alec, is quite when they were here until. So folklore tells of flat-tailed otters still being present, which is what beavers were known as. Flat-tailed otters still being present in Lochaber area, perhaps around the mid 1600s, but nobody's quite sure really. The other thing we don't really know for certain is quite why they were killed off here. But in the absence of evidence, all we can really do is surmise that the same reason they were killed off here was the same across the rest of their European range, which they've got this strange distinction, particularly when you compare them to other things that we've killed off, like wolves or bears or red kites, ospreys, sea eagles. All of those other species would have been killed off because people considered them to be a danger or a pest. And beavers' distinction is that actually it was quite the opposite. They were just too valuable for their own good. So they may, I remember in one of your previous episodes, one of your guests saying that there could have been some conflict when we started to drain land, and that's entirely possible in certain sites. But in the main, the real thing for beavers was that we hunted them for their meat. They're the second largest rodent species in the world, so they weigh up to 30 kilos as adults. So you can imagine there's a lot of eating in a time when starvation was an ever present risk. A lot of eating in an animal that size. We hunted them for castoreum, which was a secretion used in perfumes and medicines. But more than anything else, it was their thick, weather resistant pelts, which was the centre of the European hat trade for such a long time, and one of the main reasons why, once we'd wiped out almost all of our beavers in Europe, we set sail for North America for the untapped resource of brown gold, as we called beaver furs there. So yeah, too valuable for their own good is the real headline takeaway of why beavers went extinct.
Thinking about them in the context of rewilding there, there will be a bit of a continuum with some species that, the general public, the farming community are generally on board with bringing back into Scotland. And there'll be some species that are on the other end of that spectrum where, there's a lot of conflict, there's a lot of discussion to be had, and there's a lot of things to be managed. Where do you think beavers fall into that spectrum?
I think beavers probably, if we're being realistic, are perhaps the most controversial animal that we have at the moment. Yeah, I think it's the biggest wildlife conflict that we're dealing with. You could make a case for white-tailed sea eagles, but largely they've been on the west coast until now. So no less of a problem for the people there, of course, but for the rest of Scotland, perhaps that's felt a bit peripheral. Whereas beavers, because of where they began their recolonisation of this country, right in kind of heartland of prime arable ground in East Tayside, yeah, there's an argument to say that of all the places that they could have come back to this country, the place that they did return to was the one with the most potential for acute difficulties. So yeah, I think they're probably our big one at the moment, the big nut that we have to crack in terms of human wildlife coexistence.
But in terms of the practical benefits, what have you seen yourself at Argaty?
So we've seen loads of things so far, and the beavers keep on surprising us. So, I could go up tomorrow and they'll have made another change and another wee benefit for wildlife. So what they've done is created those wetlands, which are just boosting wildlife from the bottom up. Um, and doing exactly what we hoped they would do, and the things that they're a very well studied species, across Europe and across North America. We know what beavers do. We know that they bring big boosts to the surrounding ecosystem, and that's exactly what's playing out here. What I didn't expect, perhaps, was the benefits they would bring to us as a farm. So yeah, we sit quite high up the catchment. So our farm has a mix of ponds and burns which lead down into the River Teith, which of course then joins the Forth. And I think we would say that we've been finding more and more as climate change intensifies that we've been feeling the effects of it here, as most people on the land, of course, do. So these long heat wave summers where there's barely a drop to drink for anything on the land, and then these winters that you just feel the rain's never going to stop. And beavers just seem to have an answer for everything. So, in those heatwave summers, sometimes the water that beavers store behind their dams will be the only drop to drink that the sheep will have in fields. So, we can move an electric fence and allow them in behind the dam to get a drink, for example. In the wet winters, we were having real problems with a outflow stream from a pond in the hills above our farm, which just continued with these flash floods we were getting to burst out of its culvert, come down, wash away a farm track, wash through the sheds, trashing any electrical equipment that was in there. And to get someone on a digger to come and repair the farm track, you're probably talking about 400 or 500 quid each time. Sometimes just to see the floods come again the next week and wash it away again. So these things were costing us thousands of pounds every year. And it's only since we got the beavers into the hills above the farm that we've really brought an end to those problems. So in all that time, we've only lost the farm track once, and that family have been up in that pond since 2022. And what they've done effectively, Alec, is they've got a great big dam that goes across the outflow stream, and then a series of other dams downstream. So water will hit that main dam, sit there for a time. If the flood's prolonged, then it will raise up, go over the top, and go downstream, and the beavers, their next dam catches it. The water sinks down into the ground. Again, if it's a long period of rainfall, eventually it will rise up and go over, and then the next dam catches it, and the next one, the next one. So basically, what we're finding is that water just has to work really hard to get through our landscape now. Where once it went in one end of the pond and straight out the other, almost like a sink with the plug pulled out. Now it's got to vault over dams, it's got to zigzag around felled trees, it's got canals that beavers dig to flood their way out to trees they want to eat that divert its progress, and it just takes the sting out of flood events. So
All that time, it's kind of permeating into the landscape as
exactly,
it travels down.
exactly. So it's just taking the sting out, and these are just small examples from one farm. But you could imagine if you had beavers in the hills across the country doing all this across all their territories potentially, or all places that is suitable for them to build dams, you can imagine how much of this thing would be taken out of these flood events. So I think they're a really important part, not a silver bullet by any stretch, but a really important part of a whole river catchment approach to protecting valuable low ground from flood events that are just becoming more and more frequent.
And speaking about the catchment level kind of work, uh, do you have much interaction with the likes of the Forth Rivers Trust, or are there other groups in your area, and how have they received these beavers?
Yeah, so we do a little bit of work with Forth Rivers Trust, who are just in the kind of early stages of looking at things like electrofishing to see, kind of trout presence across the streams. Where we are, we do get salmon running up the east side of the farm, but there aren't beavers there at present, so there's no real interaction there. But yeah, they've been looking at trout presence, and that will be an ongoing thing that we look at how beaver dams and beaver habitat modifications might kind of impact and hopefully improve trout numbers. And then we also do a lot of work with Stirling University as well, who've been kind of probably the real leaders in a Scottish context on studying beavers since the animals came back to this country. And they're putting really good numbers on the things we're seeing. Without their hard data, it would just be us kind of quoting it on evidenced opinions. But thanks to them, we've been discovering things like the main dam in the pond I just mentioned is holding an additional million litres of water, which apparently is the equivalent of 5,000 Victorian bathtubs filled to the brim, if you like it in old money. So, we would never have had a clue about that, that was how much more was being held. They've got temperature loggers below dams, and they're showing that, beavers, because they've got these deep reservoirs on one side of the dam, this cool release of water, some of it filtering through the ground is going downstream from there. So even in heat wave summers, you get a really steady temperature in the streams below beaver dams, which is critical for survival of so many species, fish, insects, amphibians, all sorts. So yeah, lots of people working, loads of very clever PhD students doing lots of things that I don't really understand from the university, but in the fullness of time, once those results are published, we'll have lots and lots of data that will show just exactly how important these animals are.
Fantastic. And it's good to hear you talk about the water environment. I I do a bit of work with Farming and Water Scotland across the country each year. And, maybe in the last 6 months, maybe the last year, we've been kind of polling farmers that we've been interacting with to get a sense of, have you observed this year to be drier, wetter, about the same? And it's really surprising. You would think there was a bit of an east west split in Scotland, but actually it's more complicated than that. You mean there are clients in the southwest of Scotland reporting drought conditions, or in the Central Highlands where you think surely there's enough water. And water is just one of those resources that I think as a country we maybe haven't thought an awful lot about, and that's changing, obviously.
I hope it is, Alec. Yeah, I mean, it seems to me that we have got our head around the need to restore woodland, peatland, but for some reason, rivers seem to have lagged behind. But most farms will have quite important water resources running through them, and obviously we're all dependent upon water supplies. So I think it's really crucial, yeah, that we really start to look at it and, making sure that we have enough water staying on the land at all times of year, because we just don't know what the climate's going to throw at us these days, do we?
Hmm. Hmm. And in terms of biodiversity, you've mentioned salmon just previously. You talked a little bit about the insect species that you're seeing coming through. Are there any other species that weren't present at Argaty that are now there that really take your interest?
I think probably I'd be lying if I said that there was a big, big change in that respect. We are in our early days of having the beavers, and a lot of the wood that they felled is like, only in the process of rotting down now. So, what this becomes and how much wildlife is there in the future, even I can't say. I think sometimes as supporters of beavers, or in other parts of the world, supporters of wolves, perhaps are as guilty of exaggerating the benefits of these animals as people that are maybe skeptical are of exaggerating the problems. And the truth is usually somewhere closer to the middle. But what we're really seeing, and what we expect to continue seeing, probably isn't more kind of wow species, but just an increase in the ones that you would hope to have in these aquatic environments, and that's been pretty well studied, and that will be very much what we hope to continue happening. So we're definitely seeing, more frogs, more frog spawn, more buzzards and herons coming in and hunting there. I think the other thing that may be on a bit of a segue that has really pleased me as well, though, is just how much of a lifeline beavers have been in these heatwave summers for a lot of these species. So the first full summer that we had them on the farm was the summer of 22, which, if you remember, was one of those heat waves that just felt like it was never going to end. And all of the other watercourses on the farm were drying off to nothing at all. But the beavers, we got quite worried about them in one of our ponds because the water level just kept going down and down and down. And you may know that they like to have about 3 foot of water, so that then they can swim submerged from things like lynx and wolves and bears, which obviously aren't in Scotland anymore, but which they've evolved alongside and which they're very fearful of. So they want to be able to swim away from them if they can. And we got really worried about this family that we'd relocated to one pond because the water level was going down so low, and the entrances to their lodges and burrows were being exposed. We thought they're going to leave us, they're going to go down to the River Teeth because it'll be the only place still holding water in the landscape. And after all the effort and frankly quite a lot of fighting to get the beavers to our farm, they would have to go. But watching them one night, we realised that they had other ideas. So we started seeing them doing these kind of ungainly, hairy bottomed handstands, and then they'd come up pushing up armfuls of mud. And what they did was they dredged the floor of the pond, pushed up all this mud, and created these kind of mud mountains, but then these big, deep valleys running alongside them. Did it completely, it was almost like a kind of glacial landscape, but with the beavers as the glaciers, you know. Um, and they did this entirely for their own benefit, but while water was drying up all around the landscape, their wetland held water through those really harsh times, and we got so many
Mm.
species flocking to it. You know, dragonflies, damselflies, wagtails coming and hopping around on these mud islands, picking up on grubs. You know, so nothing that's like spectacular, but when you consider what these species were dealing with in those conditions, you have to think the beavers really were the difference between life and death for them in those
Mhm.
times.
And can I just ask, so you obviously you monitor your beavers very closely.
Mm.
You're familiar with how they behave. Um, I've gotten a note here to ask you about your thoughts on the beavers that were reintroduced into Argyll. Have you, I suppose, have you observed any unique behaviour with your set of beavers? Are they behaving like beavers are elsewhere in Scotland, or is there something unique about them?
No, I think they're pretty much the same as everywhere else. Sorry, that's quite a boring answer, but I mean, the truth is, we kind of know what beavers are. We know what they do. You know, there's always new things to discover about the impact they have on the landscape, and you know, this is really some of the gaps that Stirling Uni are trying to plug at the moment. You know, PhD funding, as you know, tends to be for discovering things that we don't already know. So there's lots of studies on different things that they're doing, like water temperatures and greenhouse gas emissions from ponds and such like. But no, largely, you know, they've pretty much come in and done what most beaver experts probably would tell you they do. You know, which is to to really help with the environment and help with flooding issues and drought issues, which is great. We would have felt a bit silly if they'd come in and done something else after
Yeah.
all the work of trying to get them and trying to kind of encourage people to support us in the project.
And you quite rightly acknowledged earlier on in the recording, Tom, there are some real challenges for some farmers and landowners out there. I mean, how, from your perspective, how do we balance the benefits with some of the challenges that are happening on the ground?
Well, I mean, I think yeah, you're absolutely right. It's not easy sometimes to accommodate beavers in some, thankfully, quite specific locations. You know, certain parts of Tayside, it's been really problematic for people. And yeah, they, of course, have my huge sympathies because I can't imagine it's easy. Um, in terms of kind of balancing beaver impacts, I think what's quite positive is that we'd have a national beaver strategy to grow the population, including by translocating them from these conflict sites to new parts of the country. And, you know, it's places like Argaty that they're being moved to, you know, these places where it's kind of low hanging fruit, where potential for conflict is low and potential for them to just bring benefits is really high. And thankfully, since we relocated them, various other projects have followed suit. And thus far, touch wood, there's not been any conflicts reported that I know of in any of these sites, which hopefully shows that actually, you know, a lot of the time it's a fear of change with beavers that means that people often radically oppose them rather than the actual change itself. You know, it's because, you know, we don't know what they're going to do and we worry about it, you know. And I hope that continues. In terms of further down the line, though, I mean, my hope would be that we continue to translocate them to these places. We continue to get them to places where they do bring benefits, and maybe that takes a lot of the heat out of the beaver situation. But I really hope that further down that we can realize perhaps that this is really less of a conflict between people and beavers and actually people and other people, you know. But when I sat in on the beaver strategy meetings, as someone that's kind of really in the middle, kind of got a foot in both camps of the farming world and the conservation world, it struck me that there was a lot of potential for things that we could agree on. You know, I think most people would be happy with the idea of beavers being fairly easily moved around the country, of landowners being supported to accommodate them, including by, kind of restoring riparian buffer strips of woodland, for example. You want to pay landowners to do that and you expand the beaver population. Landowner gets a bit of money in their pocket to do this. We get a healthier environment, we get more beavers. Surely all sides would be happy. But I think the thing that I found to be quite frustrating, if not at all surprising, was that this common ground seemed to be so easily lost because there's so much mutual suspicion between what we might rightly or wrongly call these two camps. And I really hope that in the fullness of time, really like one of your former guests said, I was paraphrasing a little bit, but beavers are the test that show us how to get this right, and we do support people having problems to accommodate them so we can maximize their benefits.
I'm reminded of the old adage that farmers would sometimes use the right tree in the right place. Is it a case of the right beaver in the right place? I mean, translocations are obviously happening. You're an example of that. Are there locations in Scotland where beavers are unsuitable and shouldn't be, and there are locations in Scotland where absolutely we should definitely have them?
I mean, broadly speaking, I think that applies. I think there are a few kind of caveats to say, which, first of all, it's beavers are just beavers. They'll do what they do. So there might be a wrong place, but it's probably not the wrong beaver because it's just the same as any other one. So that might be slightly different. I would say that I don't see many people proactively trying to move them into the small amounts of prime arable land that we have, and those kind of less productive areas of the country, the majority of the country, is really probably where you want to be proactively moving them to. So I guess there's some truth in kind of right place for beavers in that sense. And you would look at places like the parts of Tayside that they're in where there is conflict, and look to other European examples and say, well, okay, yeah, that's maybe somewhere that there's always going to be a heavier amount of management, to mitigate against their impacts, to remove beavers from there if mitigation isn't possible, and as a last resort, lethal control. So, yeah, I think it's an adaptive situation. We have to keep options open like that, and hopefully, then we'll realise that actually, most of the country is probably the right place for beavers and probably okay. That's what I'd say.
And so there are obviously some options available to farmers who are having trouble with beavers. There are some mitigation options to put in place. What are some of the kind of where should farmers go is my question if they are having an issue with beavers in your experience, what have you done on your farm and how can other farmers replicate that?
Yeah, sure. So there's various options that they can take. The main one I would say is to go to Nature Scot, so the government's national nature agency, and if you Google Beavers Nature Scot, you'll find the team, and that they provide free advice on beaver impacts and what can be done about them. So that would be the first port of call. There's some mitigation that they will provide at kind of taxpayer expense, so they have a mitigation fund. Um, it's, I suppose, is discretionary the right word? They basically have to decide if this is largely in the public interest to apply these mitigations, if they'll work, and if it's largely deemed to be a sensible use of public funds to do it. But there is some mitigation available. It may be that if ultimately you really kind of want to keep the beaver on the land where possible, or in the water as it were, because they're territorial animals, and that if you have beavers there, then they're keeping out other animals, and if other animals come in, they'll want to build their own dams, fell new trees, build their own lodges. So arguably their impact is going to be more dramatic than the previous inhabitants. So where possible, if you can live with them, it's a good thing. But there are, of course, some instances where their impact or the fear of their impact is too great, and they may have to be removed. In which case, Nature Scot would bring in Beaver Trust, who would try to trap and relocate them. And as a last resort, beyond all that, if all other methods fail, there is lethal control available. But these things would all be explained by Nature Scott to any concerned farmer.
Do you know, as you're saying that, I did hear I don't know if funny is the right word, but a really interesting story about beavers. And I haven't had this independently verified, and obviously I can't ask the beaver if it did this. But I did hear of a beaver that was translocated to Loch Lomond, and I don't know whether they were tagged. Is that the right phrase? But
Yeah.
it was tagged and monitored, and they were tracking its movements, and they think that it was maybe looking for a mate, but it had kind of headed south away from Loch Lomond. And I think by the time they just about caught it, it was not terribly far from the Clyde. And well, it was obviously a very persistent beaver that knew what it was looking for, but it would have had to go very far south before it found what it was looking for. Um,
Yeah, I mean, that's something actually, and it possibly is worth coming back to the question of the right beaver in the right place with this, because they are a highly mobile species, and that's worth noting. They will, move quite far. They can go across land if need be. Um, Kits will disperse. The young will disperse when they're old enough to try and find a territory and a mate. So yeah, they do travel. And perhaps sometimes, I guess this is one of the reasons why I would maybe hesitate to use the right beaver in the right place phrase, because it kind of creates the impression that beavers will stay static where they release, where actually we know that they're going to be they're already quite widespread in parts of central Scotland already, and they will continue to be more and more widespread. Wildlife doesn't respect boundaries that humans draw on maps.
Looking ahead into the future, Tom, obviously I'll not hold you to any of this, but I mean, where do you see the story for beavers going in Scotland? I mean, where are we likely to see beavers in the future, or are you just looking to see them increase in range generally?
I would like to see them present across the country in all places that we can kind of manage as a society to have them, and that's a real question of kind of society's tolerance for the animals. What I would really like, and I think that will happen, I mean, they've already been fairly widely translocated around the country. We know the numbers are going to grow, and that they're going to be more and more widespread. The real question, and this is something that we're trying very much to kind of gently explain to people in farming, is not whether beavers are going to be back in the country. That question's already been settled a long time ago. It's how quickly they'll be back, and frankly how many of them are killed along the way, because there are still a certain number being killed every year. So I hope that we can get them back across the country as swiftly as possible to help with the environmental crisis. I hope that we can support people to manage their impacts. And I think one of my big hopes really isn't so much for beavers, but actually for people, that we can take some of the heat out of these arguments and stop being quite so oppositional towards each other. And I think both sides of the argument, the conservation side and the land management side, probably need to think about how we have better conversations about this. I would really like conservation to try and understand that, yes, it does actually matter if your field is flooded. If you said to a conservationist, you're going to lose a chunk of your office because it's going to be flooded for something that's not your fault, they would understandably be pretty annoyed about that, and it's not really any different, for the farmer in the field. I would like farmers and their representatives to maybe try and take the heat out of some of their arguments as well. In particular, I would really like us to stop using these really, I think, quite exaggerated claims that beavers are a threat to food security, because the land that they're impacting often isn't an essential food crop. Sometimes it is, but when we consider that how much of good land is used to produce crops that go into alcohol, into biscuits, into crisps, into animal feed. Then we consider how much of our vegetable produce is thrown out uneaten. This argument that has really been the basis for so much killing of wildlife, that beavers are a threat to food security. So by extension, the nation's going to starve because of these animals. I mean, it doesn't really stand up to much reason, I don't think. I would just like us to be really a little bit more honest and say, what beavers actually can be a threat to is individual earnings of farmers, and that's serious. But that's actually the problem we need to deal with and to help people to get by on. And I think if we could get better at that conversation and be a bit more honest with each other, a bit less oppositional, then we would make real headway.
And we've talked a little bit about the perception of the farming community, but obviously members of the general public are coming to Argaty red kites. They're seeing these beavers. What's the reception of the general public towards the reintroduction of beavers?
Really positive, I think, in the main. If don't get me wrong, I think we are, as a society, quite distant from wildlife and the environment, and I don't think we would have the problems that we had if more people cared about it. But for those who do take an interest and do care, they're really positive about these animals. They're well supported. I mean, when we did our consultations on the idea of first bringing beavers to the farm, they were hugely well supported. We had hundreds of people in support of it and only a very small number against. And that's really been replicated with every translocation since then. Huge amounts of community support. I think beavers have got a pretty good press. People are understanding more and more just how important they are to the environment, and it's been lovely actually having them here. We were lucky when the kites first came back that people started coming up to the farm to see them, and there was just this wow factor because most had never seen them before, never imagined they would see them back in Scotland again, and we were lucky enough to be able to show people that. And it's been the same with the beavers. We didn't think we'd get that moment again, but we've got this species that most people have never seen before, but they've heard a lot about, and had some really special times of people coming up. We've had kids with terminal illnesses, we've had families, we've had school groups, just all sorts, and just really quite emotional sometimes to allow give people the chance to see these things in a natural environment. It's really quite special.
And we mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, but this is part three of a kind of three-part discussion that we've had on beaver reintroductions in Scotland. So, reflecting on that a little bit, what do you think the beaver story generally tells us about the future of farming in Scotland and land use? I mean, you yourself, Argaty Red Kites, hosted one of our farm wildlife walks through the Farm Advisory
Mhm.
Service. Do you feel positive about the direction of change that farming's moving in?
I think it's moving in the right direction. Where I possibly have some concerns is how quickly it's moving, and whether we're going far enough and fast enough. What I, in terms of the environmental goals of farming, I mean, what I really hope that people that visit Argty come away thinking is that food production and nature restoration aren't the opposing forces that they've sometimes been made out to be. We produce more food since having beavers here and doing more for nature than we did before they arrived. And I think it just shows that in most places that's entirely possible to do. You have to be a bit targeted about using silage at the right times, rotational grazing, all these things that farmers are doing anyway. But there's a site here that I really like to take people to, Alec, and what I make them do is I make them look down a hill towards a beaver wetland, and you see some trees felled, you see some dams, very obviously beavers in there. So I make them turn round, do a 180, and look at the surrounding landscape, and it looks like a standard Scottish hill farm. And I really hope that what we're doing might just be a small step of just showing that you can have these animals in most landscapes and it won't turn your world upside down. It's not the big change that sometimes it's made out to be, and it's possible to still be working the land, still producing food while making a bit of space for them.
Do you know, Tom, my next question was going to be your closing thoughts, but if you don't mind me saying, I think that was pretty bang on. That was great. Um, Tom, can I just bring the podcast to a bit of a close this afternoon? How do people reach out to you? How do they get in touch with Argaty Red Kites, and what kind of projects are you working on in the future?
Sure. So people can get in touch with us through our website, argatyredkites.co.uk, or through most of the social media that a man in his 40s is able to deal with. So Instagram, Facebook, no TikTok or anything like that. And we're just down as Argaty Red Kites on there. So yeah, welcome engagement from the wider community. And if people want to come up and see what the beavers have done here, we run various tours to see the landscapes and see the beavers themselves. So all of that's advertised through the website and on Facebook if people are interested.
Tom Bowser, on behalf of the Farm Advisory Service, thanks very much for coming on Thrill of the Hill. I hope you've enjoyed your time, and I'm sure people will enjoy the listen.
Thanks so much for having me, Alec.
Thanks very much for listening to this episode of Thrill of the Hill. If you've enjoyed this episode, you can try one of our other FAS podcasts, like Stock Talk, our livestock-focused podcast with senior consultant James Orr, or join ecologist Harry Fisher over on the Natural Capital podcast to hear all things biodiversity. Thrill of the Hill is brought to you in association with the Scottish Government. Executive producers Kirsten Blackwood and Kerry Hammond, producer Heather Stewart, editor Kieran Sims, and presented by me, Alex Perry.
The Farm Advisory Service podcast. Audio advice on livestock, crops and soils, environment, rural business, and more. Brought to you in association with the Scottish Government.